So the next passage is going to be about British colonialism. So this is a meme that we found somewhere. So also putting it across. So in some sense, also me, British colonialism was my first passage in the exam. This is the first passage that I attempted. It took me about 3 full reads of the entire passage to get the hang of what this entire passage is about. I hope you have paused the video and then read this, or there's going to be PDF available somewhere close by, either in the description or as a part of this lesson. So read the entire passage and then come back to this video. So we will start discussing this passage. British colonialism is a proper challenging, tough passage. Lots of new vocabulary. There are many words that you have no clue about, but you still can go through this passage if you have the temperament to read through this passage and understand what this is. Right? So we'll start with this. British colonial policy went through 2 policy phases, or at least there were 2 strategies between which its policies actually oscillated, sometimes to its great advantage. At first, new colonial apparatus exercised caution and occupied India by a mix of military power and subtle diplomacy. Okay, so what are they talking about? I have no clue. They are saying 2 strategies. It worked really well for them. It oscillated between the 2 strategies, 2 policy phases. So many things they have conveyed, but they have not essentially conveyed anything so far. One tangible thing we can take away from this is that occupied India by a mix of military power and subtle diplomacy. So these are 2 things they are comparing. The high ground in the middle of the circle of circles. So they are trying to convey something. I still have no clue what they are trying to convey. This, however, pushed them into contradictions. So now we have something. So they are saying they use subtle diplomacy, and then they also used military power to colonize India. Because these 2 are contradictory, they found some trouble. So that is what we are looking at. For whatever their sense of strangeness of the country and the thinness of the colonial presence, the British colonial state represented the great conquering discourse of Enlightenment rationalism, entering India precisely at the moment of its greatest unchecked arrogance. So whose greatest unchecked arrogance? Most likely Britishers' greatest unchecked colonial arrogance is when they entered India. What do they mean by this? Whatever their sense of strangeness to the country and the thinness of colonial presence. So they say, hey, they found it like being an outsider. Obviously, they are not Indians, so they were an outsider. The British colonial state represented the great conquering discourse of Enlightenment rationalism. What is Enlightenment rationalism? We have no clue about. Let us come. When we come there, we come there. As inheritors and representatives of this discourse. So discourse is, giving a discourse means giving a, what do you mean by that? Following an idea, giving a discourse is equivalent of having a satsang in some sense. So an idea that is being used can be called as discourse, which carried everything before it. This colonial state could hardly adopt for long such a self-denying attitude. I still have no clue what this is trying to convey. See guys, I should be able to explain this, I agree, but the idea behind this is how I went through this entire passage in my actual exam is what I'm trying to replicate. So I want you to go through this with me so that you see what my thought process is and how do you approach this, more than understanding everything that is given in the passage and being able to answer. Understanding everything and then answering the passage is going to naturally come the moment you understand everything. But what if you don't get something and still you want to answer this passage? You are in a rock and hard place. How do you figure out? How do you go about it? That is what we are going to look into this. It had restructured everything in Europe. What had? I think the colonialism has restructured everything in Europe. The productive system, political regime, so the produce, the politics, moral and cognitive orders, and would do the same in India, particularly as some empirically inclined theorist of the generation considered the colonies as a massive laboratory, lab of utilitarian or other theoretical experiments. So they say one key idea you can take away is that the colonizing countries considered their colonies as some form of lab rats. One idea I know now. Okay. Consequently, the colonial state could not settle simply for its eminence. Eminence, what is eminence? Fame. At the cost of its marginality. What do you mean by that? It began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity into Indian society. So what does this statement mean? Consequently, followed by something. whatever we discussed before, the colonial state could not settle simply for the fame. So let's say the Britishers have come to India, they have colonized the state, right? But they could not just settle for the fame of ruling India in some sense at the cost of its marginality. What do I mean by that? They felt marginalized. How did they feel marginalized? Is because they are modern, they have lot of things that they were capable of doing, but the Indian society was not capable of doing. The Indian society was not modern by any standards at that point of time, which means they felt marginalized because they were kind of very small sliver of people across such a big nation, which means they wanted to improve this by introducing modernism into the country. Sometimes its initiatives were resisted by pre-existing structural forms. So there were already societal structures available in the country. So whatever they tried to introduce, it was faced with resistance. At times there was a more direct form of collective resistance. Therefore the map of continuity and discontinuity that this state left behind at the time of independence was rather complex and has to be traced with care. So they say the modernity, British tried to impose the modernity because they did not want to feel marginalized, though they had fame, right? But they were faced with resistance at multiple stages. So there are some form of continuity and discontinuity when independence happened for our country. Most significantly, of course, initiatives for modernity came to assume an external character. What do you mean by that? The initiative for modernity, the British wanted to introduce modernity inside India. It came from an external character, which means the society did not itself transform into a modern society, but it was forced down upon the society. The acceptance of modernity came to be connected ineradicably. What I mean by that? Cannot eradicate or cannot disappear. So it has to be there with subjection. Subjection means thrusting something down their throat is what you call a subjection. Forced upon a country is called subjection. This again points to two different problems, one theoretical, the other political. Theoretically, because modernity was externally introduced, it is explanatorily unhelpful to apply the logical format of the transition process to this pattern of change. We have long sentences. So it talks about, one is theoretical, one is political. Two problems we have. So the theoretical problem is that theoretically, because modernity was externally introduced, it is explanatorily unhelpful to apply the logical format of the transition process to this pattern of change. What do you mean by that? See, every statement has 2 layers, 3 layers behind this. The logical format of the transition process could have been applied had it happened, had the modernity process happened internally, naturally. Such a logical format would be wrong on 2 counts. First, however subtly, it would imply that what was proposed to be built was something like European capitalism. Correct. So they are saying, however subtle it was, it would imply that they were trying to build something that is close to European capitalism. And in any case, historians have forcefully argued that what it was to replace was not like feudalism, with or without modificatory adjectives. So they were not replacing feudalism. See, in Europe, the Middle Ages or feudal ages existed, right? So it is, let's say, 1500s, 1600s, where the age of feudalism. From there, they transitioned to modernism. Right? Now, this transition naturally happened. Right? It was not forced. So they are saying this is not something that naturally happened, but it was forced upon. More fundamentally, the logical structure of endogenous means coming from inside, coming naturally or from inside, does not apply here. Here, transformation agendas attack as an external force. This externality is not something that can be casually mentioned and forgotten, which means there was force used upon to make sure this modernity was thrust down the throats of India or Indians as a society. It is inscribed on every move, every object, every proposal, every legislative act, each line of causality. So everything that happened was motivated by pushing through this agenda of modernism. It comes to be marked on the epoch itself. Epoch means age. Golden epoch means a golden age. This repetitive emphasis on externality should not be seen as a nationalist initiative that is so well rehearsed in Indian social science. So I don't really get what they are trying to say. They are saying the repetitive emphasis on externality. So far they have talked about how externally it is forced and all of that. They are saying it should not be seen as a nationalist initiative like how the Indian social science tells you. Right? So that is what they are saying. Quite apart from the externality of the entire historical proposal of modernity, some of its content were remarkable. Economic reforms, or rather alterations, did not foreshadow the construction of a classical capitalist economy. They are saying, apart from the externality, apart from the fact that it has been brought from outside, it has been forced upon, it did something that were remarkable. So economic reforms, or rather alterations, were remarkable, did not foreshadow the construction of a classical capitalist economy with its necessary emphasis on extractive and transport sectors. So there were emphasis, but they are saying it did not foreshadow the construction. So this did not lead to an extractive or transportation sector emphasized capitalist economy. So they are saying this did not build an economy, or this was not a precursor for an economy that is being built that emphasized on extractive and transport sectors. What happened was the creation of a degenerate version of capitalism, what early dependency theorists called development of underdevelopment. So what do I mean by that? They are saying it is not what they wanted to, but this is what they got out of this entire process. So I understand some parts, bits and pieces, parts of this entire passage. Now let's see how can I answer these questions. All of the following statements can be inferred from the first paragraph except that, which means you have to find out 3 sentences that can be inferred from the first paragraph. Was at least partly an outcome of Enlightenment rationalism. Has it been discussed? I think it was discussed. Part of Enlightenment rationalism, it has been discussed. So British colonialism, definitely this is part of your 3 sentences that you want to find out. Faced resistance from existing structural forms of Indian modernity. Have they ever mentioned something about Indian modernity? Let us go back. They said faced structural resistance by pre-existing structural forms. There is no mention of Indian modernity, just from India. So this could be your answer. Was at least partly shaped by the project of European modernity? Definitely yes. Through European modernity, yes, it is definitely mentioned. Where is it mentioned? So they said Europe is kind of stood out, the marginality was there, so the logic of modernity is what something they wanted to introduce so that they'll also feel welcome here, right? So this is given, this is part of your things that, not the except statement. Allowed the treatment of colonies as experimental sites, definitely given in the first paragraph. So all these 3 things can be inferred. This is one thing that cannot be inferred. So option B is your answer. All of the following statements, if true, could be seen as supporting the arguments except. So in the exam, when I got here, I was already tired. The passage was tough tasking, and I am already, second question that I am facing is also an except statement, which means 3 statements should be supporting, 4th statement won't be supporting the passage. So I want to find out 3 statements that will support and then figure out what is that 4th statement. Introduction of capitalism in India was not through transformation of feudalism as happened in Europe. This is supporting. This is what exactly what was mentioned and what we had discussed. From the little parts that we understood from the passage, this was definitely one part that we understood. Modernity was imposed upon India by the British and therefore led to underdevelopment. I think this was also mentioned. Or in some sense, this, if this is true, will support the passage, argument in the passage. Throughout the history of colonial conquest, natives have often been experimented by the colonizers. I think this also will support what the author has to say. The change in British colonial policy was induced by resistance to modernity in Indian society. No. The change in British colonial policy was to induce modernity in the Indian society, not the other way around. So option D is your answer. Question 3. Consequently, the colonial state could not settle simply for eminence at the cost of its marginality. We had discussed this statement. It began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity into Indian society. Which of the following best capture the sense of the statement? Colonial state's eminence was unsettled by its marginal position. Therefore, it developed Indian society by modernizing it. Sounds close. But unsettled, I am not sure. So they're saying simply for eminence. They are saying, hey, I just did not want to settle for the fame I have. I already have fame. I have fame, but I don't want to just settle for this. I want more. What do I mean by more? I want to feel marginalized. So if I don't want to feel marginalized, I should introduce modernity into the country. So this is not really what you are looking for. Colonial enterprise was a costly one. So to justify the cost, take down initiative, introduce logic, modernity. No, not discussed at all. Colonial state felt marginalized from the Indian society because of its own modernity. Absolutely. Therefore, it sought to address that marginalization by bringing its modernity to change Indian society. This absolutely captures the thought process. This is your answer. The cost of colonial state's eminence was not settled. Cost, nobody cares about the cost. It is not about cost at all. Initiative or introducing, not your answer. So option C is your answer. Which one of the following 5-word sequences best captures the flow of the arguments in the passage? Military power, arrogance, laboratory, modernity, capitalism, not really. Colonial policy, enlightenment, external modernity, subjection, underdevelopment. I think this is yes. We'll see. Colonial policy. The passage starts with colonial policy. Then the passage starts with colonial policy. Then we have about enlightenment, rationalism. Then we have we do have external modernity, which means the modernity has been subjected from outside and not from inside. Modernity assumed to came an external character. So this is the third idea that is being discussed. The last idea obviously is underdevelopment. In between we had one more idea, which is subjection. Yes, we also had discussed subjection. Where is that? Somewhere here it was subject. Here, subjection. So next external character was subjection, and then we have underdevelopment. So option 2 is your answer. Question 5. Which of the following observations is a valid conclusion to draw from the author's statement? Logical structure of endogenous change does not apply here. Here transformation agendas attack as an external force. This is where they are comparing feudalistic society from where they transformed into a modern society versus your Indian society that did not want to transform. So they had to bring in external forces to make them transform into modern something. The endogenous logic of colonialism can only bring change if it attacks and transforms external forces. Not really. Endogenous logic of colonialism bring change only if it attacks and transforms. Not really. Indian society is not endogamous. Endo sounds close, but endogamous not what we have discussed. More accurately characterized as aggressively exogamous. Nope. Colonized societies cannot be changed through logic. They need to be transformed with external force. This is something that did happen. It sounds close, but I don't think this is the answer. Transformation of Indian society did not happen organically, which means naturally. It really did not happen naturally, but was forced by colonial agendas. This is your answer. Right? So question number 5, answer is option D. The transformation of Indian society did not happen organically, but was forced by colonial agendas is your answer. Best wishes for CAT, guys.